Welcome back. In this section, we're going to be going over validations, because every form needs good validations, and Angular comes with some great built-in ones that you're going to want to use. To add validations to our review form, the first thing we need to do is to turn off default HTML validations. Browsers sometimes have this built in, and we don't want to do it. We want to be more consistent. So let's run no validate in our form tag as an attribute. Next, let's mark the fields that are required for our form by simply adding the required attribute, like you see here. Lastly, to see if our form is validating properly, let's simply add some debugging code here. We'll say review form is reviewform.$valid, which will be true or false. There's some Angular magic going on here. First, notice that our form has a name attribute, and the name is review form. That's where we get that first part of that expression. And then when we call $valid, $sign means we're referencing a property on the form, and that's a built-in property from Angular. We're not having to define valid anywhere. It comes with Angular. Now if we jump back into our form and we fill out all the fields, you'll see that valid turns from false to true, as you might expect it to. There's another cool thing here going on where if we play around with the email address, you'll notice that it's validating that it's a proper email address. Kind of neat. Now, if we have this invalid email address and the form is invalid, can we submit the form? Yeah, we can still submit the form. We don't want that. We'll need to prevent that from getting submitted. Really, we only want that add review function to be called if the form is valid. So using our knowledge of the review form valid property, we can put that inside ng submit. So when this form is submitted, if valid is false, then add review will never get called. Only if valid is true will the second part of the expression be evaluated and add review get called. Now, if we have an invalid form and we attempt to submit it, nothing happens. Well, that's good, but we still need to give the user some sort of hint of why their form is invalid. Well, if we looked at the HTML that gets rendered on our page, in particular the form elements, we would see that the input value before we started typing email has a class of ngPristine, which means it hasn't been touched, and ngInvalid, which means the email is not valid. As we start typing inside that field, the class changes. The class gets updated to ng-dirty, but it's still invalid, so it still has ngInvalid. Then, after we have a valid email, that ngInvalid turns into ng-valid. All this is default magic that Angular adds for you. So, with this in mind, let's highlight these form fields using classes after we start typing to see if a field is valid or invalid. So let's jump in and write some CSS. We can check to see if it's invalid and dirty, then we'll use one border color, this is red, and if it's valid and dirty, we'll change it to green. You might be wondering why we use ngDirty at all. That's because we don't want these borders to show up until they've started typing. Now if we jump back into our form, you can see as we start typing an email address, it turns red until it's valid, and then it turns green. You might also notice the live preview doesn't render this value until it's valid. It's kind of neat. As you see, Angular has built-in email validation, a lot like HTML5 form validation. It also can validate URLs or even numbers. And when you have a number, you can even specify a minimum and maximum. Time for you to try out validation, and I'll see you in level 4. You're watching Warming Up with Angular.
Shaping up.
Welcome to Warming Up with Angular.
Shaping up.
Welcome.